Staff Sergeant Maria Santos had been in Iraq for 8 months when everything changed on that dusty Tuesday morning in Fallujah. The 8-year-old Army medic from Phoenix, Arizona, never imagined that her routine patrol would become a fight for survival that would test every limit of human endurance. The sun was already blazing at 7 a.m. when Maria's convoy of 3 Humvees rolled through the narrow streets of the Al-Anbar province. She sat in the second vehicle, her medical bag secured between her boots, checking her supplies for the 3rd time that morning. The team was heading to a school where they planned to provide medical assistance to local children and gather intelligence about insurgent activities in the area. Maria had joined the army 6 years earlier, driven by a desire to serve her country and help people. Her family thought she was crazy for choosing such a dangerous job, but Maria knew this was her calling. She had already saved dozens of lives during her deployment, earning respect from soldiers who initially doubted whether a woman could handle the pressure of combat medicine. The convoy moved slowly through the crowded marketplace. Children ran alongside the vehicles, some waving, others throwing stones. Maria watched the faces in the crowd, looking for signs of trouble. Her training had taught her to read people, to spot the nervous glances and sudden movements that might signal danger. Sergeant Rodriguez, the convoy leader, spoke into his radio from the lead vehicle. Everything seemed normal until they turned onto Haifa Street, a narrow road lined with 2-story buildings. The area had been quiet for weeks, making it seem like a safe route to their destination. At exactly 7:47 a.m., the first shot rang out. The bullet shattered the passenger window of Maria's Humvee, sending glass flying across the interior. Before anyone could react, automatic gunfire erupted from multiple directions. The insurgents had planned their ambush perfectly, positioning themselves in buildings on both sides of the street. "Contact! Contact!" Rodriguez screamed into his radio as bullets slammed into the armored vehicles. The sound was deafening, like hail hitting a metal roof. But Maria knew this hail could kill. Private Johnson, who was driving Maria's vehicle, immediately tried to reverse, but the narrow street made it impossible to turn around. They were trapped between the buildings, exactly where the enemy wanted them. Maria's training kicked in automatically. She grabbed her medical bag and prepared for casualties. Even as bullets continued to strike their vehicle, the Humvee's armor was holding, but she could hear the distinct whistle of rounds passing dangerously close. "We need to get out of this kill zone," Johnson shouted over the noise of gunfire and the engine. He floored the accelerator, trying to push through to the other end of the street. That's when Maria saw the rocket-propelled grenade streaking toward them. The explosion flipped their Humvee like a toy, sending it crashing into a concrete barrier. Maria felt herself thrown against the roof, then the side panel. Then everything went black for several seconds. When she opened her eyes, smoke was filling the overturned vehicle and she could taste blood in her mouth. "Johnson! Thompson!" she called to her teammates. Johnson was unconscious, blood running from a gash on his forehead. Thompson was conscious but trapped under twisted metal, his left leg bent at an unnatural angle. The gunfire hadn't stopped. If anything, it had gotten worse. Maria could hear the insurgents moving closer, their voices growing louder as they coordinated their attack. She knew they had minutes, maybe less, before the enemy reached their position. Maria managed to kick out the rear window of the overturned Humvee. Glass cut through her uniform and into her arms, but adrenaline masked the pain. She pulled her rifle from where it had fallen and checked her ammunition. 2 magazines left. "Thompson, we have to move," she whispered to her wounded teammate. "Can't move my leg," he gasped. "Think it's broken bad." Maria made a decision that would haunt her later. She couldn't carry Thompson and fight at the same time. She had to find cover and call for backup, then return for her teammates. "I'm going to find a position and call for help," she told Thompson. "Stay quiet and stay down." Maria crawled out of the wrecked vehicle, staying low as bullets continued to crack overhead. The street was filled with smoke from burning vehicles and the smell of gunpowder. She could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions in the surrounding buildings. She spotted a small shop about 30 yards away, with concrete walls thick enough to stop bullets. If she could reach it, she could establish a defensive position and radio for help. The problem was crossing 30 yards of open ground, while insurgents were shooting at anything that moved. Maria took 3 deep breaths, said a quick prayer, and ran. She made it 15 yards before the first bullet found her. The impact spun her around and sent her tumbling to the ground. The bullet had hit her right shoulder, shattering bone and sending waves of pain through her entire body. But she was still conscious, still alive, still fighting. Maria forced herself to keep moving, half crawling, half running toward the shop. 2 more bullets hit her before she reached cover. One grazed her left thigh, the other punched through her stomach just below her body armor. She collapsed behind the concrete wall of the shop, gasping for air and trying to assess her wounds. The shoulder wound was bleeding heavily. The stomach wound was worse, and her left leg wasn't working properly, but she was alive, and she had her radio. "Falcon Base, this is Medic 1. She whispered into her radio. "We have 3 vehicles down on Haifa Street. Multiple casualties. Immediate assistance required." The radio crackled back. "Medic 1. We copy. Relief force is 20 minutes out. Can you hold your position? 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. Maria could already hear insurgents moving through the wreckage of her convoy, searching for survivors. She had to protect Thompson and Johnson, who were still trapped in the overturned Humvee. Maria checked her weapon and counted her remaining ammunition. 18 rounds in her current magazine, 30 more in her spare. She positioned herself at the corner of the shop where she could see the wreckage of her vehicle. 3 insurgents were approaching the Humvee, AK-47 rifles ready. Maria took careful aim despite the pain in her shoulder and fired 3 precise shots. All 3 men went down. More insurgents appeared from other directions. Maria continued firing, trying to keep them away from her wounded teammates. But with each shot, more enemies seemed to take the place of those she had hit. The 4th bullet hit her in the back as she was reloading. The 5th and 6th bullets came almost simultaneously, one hitting her left arm and another striking her right leg. The pain was becoming unbearable, but Maria refused to give up. She managed to reload her rifle and continue firing. Her accuracy was decreasing as blood loss and pain affected her coordination, but she kept shooting. Every round she fired bought more time for the relief force to arrive. The 7th bullet shattered her left wrist. The 8th went through her right lung, making it difficult to breathe. The 9th and 10th bullets hit within seconds of each other, one in her left leg and one in her right side. Maria was now lying flat against the concrete wall, barely able to hold her rifle. Her vision was starting to blur, and she could feel her strength fading, but she could still hear movements near the wrecked Humvee where her teammates were trapped. With enormous effort, she raised her rifle one more time and fired her last few rounds at shadows moving in the smoke. She thought she hit at least one more insurgent, but couldn't be sure. The 11th bullet hit her in the chest, just above her heart. Maria fell backward against the wall, her rifle sliding from her hands. Blood was flowing from multiple wounds, soaking her uniform and pooling on the concrete floor beneath her. She could barely breathe, and her vision was fading in and out, but somehow, impossibly, she was still conscious. The sound of gunfire was fading now. Either the insurgents were pulling back or her hearing was failing. Maria tried to speak into her radio but found she could barely whisper. "Falcon Base," she managed to say. "This is Medic 1. I'm hit bad. Multiple wounds. Still in the shop on Haifa Street. Thompson and Johnson are in the overturned Humvee, about 30 yards east of my position." The radio was silent for a long moment. Then, "Medic 1. Relief force is still 15 minutes out. Stay with us." 15 minutes. Maria closed her eyes and tried to focus on staying alive for 15 more minutes. She thought about her family back in Phoenix, about her mother who had begged her not to deploy, about her younger brother who looked up to her. She thought about Thompson and Johnson, hoping they were still alive in the wreckage. She thought about all the soldiers she had saved during her deployment. All the lives that had meaning because she had been there to help. Maria pressed her hand against the worst of her wounds, trying to slow the bleeding. She had treated enough gunshot victims to know that her situation was critical. She was losing blood fast, and several of her wounds were in dangerous locations. But she was still breathing, still conscious, still alive. The shop where she had taken cover was small and dark, filled with the smell of spices and dust. Scattered around her were bags of rice and cans of food that the shop owner had abandoned when the shooting started. Maria tried to make herself as comfortable as possible against the wall, conserving what little energy she had left. Outside, the street had grown quiet except for the occasional crack of a rifle or the distant sound of an engine. She could hear voices speaking Arabic, but they sounded farther away now. Maybe the insurgents were regrouping, or maybe they thought all the Americans were dead. Maria checked her watch. She had been hit 4 minutes ago. 11 minutes until help arrived. She closed her eyes and focused on breathing. Each breath was painful, but each breath meant she was still alive. She had survived the initial ambush, survived 11 gunshot wounds, and established a defensive position. Now she just had to survive long enough for rescue. But as Maria lay there bleeding in the abandoned shop, she had no idea that help was much farther away than 15 minutes. The relief force had run into another ambush, 2 miles away, and was pinned down themselves. It would be 3 days before anyone could reach her. Maria's radio had gone silent 6 hours ago, and the sun was beginning to set on her first day in the abandoned shop. The silence was almost worse than the gunfire had been. At least during the firefight, she knew what was happening. Now, lying in a pool of her own blood with 11 bullet wounds, she could only guess whether help was coming. The pain had evolved from sharp, stabbing sensations to a deep, throbbing ache that seemed to pulse through her entire body. Maria had used strips torn from her uniform to create makeshift bandages for the worst wounds, but blood was still seeping through the fabric. Her medical training told her exactly how serious her situation was, which made it both easier and harder to deal with. She had managed to drag herself deeper into the shop, away from the entrance where insurgents might spot her. Behind a stack of rice bags, she found a small space where she could lean against 2 walls for support. It wasn't comfortable, but it was hidden and gave her a view of both the front entrance and a small window facing the street. As darkness fell, Maria heard voices outside again. Arabic conversations that seemed to be moving through the area systematically. She held her breath and pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself invisible. The voices passed by her shop twice, but no one entered. Maria's biggest immediate problem wasn't the pain or even the blood loss. It was thirst. She had lost a lot of blood, and her body was crying out for water. Looking around the shop, she spotted several bottles of water on a shelf near the counter. The problem was getting to them without making noise or reopening her wounds. It took Maria almost an hour to crawl the 15 feet to the water bottles. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body, and she had to stop several times to rest. By the time she reached the shelf, she was exhausted and dizzy, but she had water. The first sip was like a miracle. Maria had never realized how good clean water could taste. She forced herself to drink slowly, knowing that her stomach wound made it dangerous to drink too much too fast. But even small sips helped clear her head and gave her strength. With water secured, Maria turned her attention to her wounds. The bullet in her chest had missed her heart by inches, but it had collapsed part of her right lung. Breathing was difficult, and she had to concentrate on taking slow, deliberate breaths. The stomach wound was bleeding internally, but there was nothing she could do about that, except try to stay still. The shoulder wound had stopped bleeding, but her right arm was almost useless. The bullets in her legs made it impossible to walk, but she could still move by crawling. The wound in her back felt like it had missed her spine, but she couldn't be sure. Every wound was serious enough to require immediate surgery. Yet here she was, alone in an abandoned shop in enemy territory. Maria spent the night drifting in and out of consciousness. Sometimes she dreamed she was back home in Phoenix, sitting in her mother's kitchen while the smell of fresh tortillas filled the air. Other times she dreamed she was in the field hospital, treating wounded soldiers who looked exactly like her. When dawn came, Maria realized she had survived her first night. It was a small victory, but an important one. She was still alive, still thinking clearly most of the time, and still determined to survive. The second day brought new challenges. The shop was getting hot as the sun climbed higher, and Maria was sweating despite her blood loss. Sweat mixed with blood created a sticky mess that attracted flies. She tried to wave them away, but her movements were getting weaker. Around midday, Maria heard vehicles outside. Her heart jumped, thinking it might be American forces. But the voices she heard were Arabic again. Through the small window, she could see insurgents setting up some kind of checkpoint or observation post across the street. They were settling in for a longer stay. This changed everything. Maria couldn't risk making any noise during the day now. She couldn't move around to get food or water. She couldn't even shift position to relieve pressure on her wounds. She had to remain absolutely still and silent for hours at a time. The insurgents stayed across the street for most of the afternoon. Maria could hear them talking, sometimes laughing, occasionally arguing. She understood a few words of Arabic from her time in Iraq, enough to know they were discussing American patrols and planning future attacks. They had no idea that one of their targets was bleeding out less than 50 feet away. By evening, Maria's condition had worsened noticeably. The internal bleeding from her stomach wound was making her feel weak and nauseous. Her vision would blur periodically, and she had to fight to stay conscious. But she was still alive, still fighting. The insurgents finally left at sunset, giving Maria a chance to move around again. She crawled to different parts of the shop, looking for anything useful. Behind the counter, she found a small first aid kit that the shop owner had left behind. It contained bandages, antiseptic, and pain medication. Not much, but enough to help. Maria cleaned and rebandaged her wounds as best she could in the dark. The antiseptic burned like fire, but she knew infection was as dangerous as the bullets themselves. She took 2 of the pain pills, hoping they would help her sleep. The second night was worse than the first. The pain medication helped a little, but Maria's body was starting to shut down from blood loss and trauma. She found herself shivering even though the night was warm. Her hands shook when she tried to hold the water bottle. Several times she felt herself starting to slip away, but she fought back each time. Maria began talking to herself to stay awake. She told herself stories about home, about her family, about the soldiers she had saved. She recited her medical training, going through procedures step by step. She sang songs quietly under her breath, anything to keep her mind active and alert. By dawn of the 3rd day, Maria was barely conscious. She had stopped bleeding externally, but she could feel that something was seriously wrong inside her body. Her skin was pale and cold, and her breathing was shallow and rapid. She knew these were signs of severe blood loss and shock, but she was still alive. The 3rd day passed in a haze of pain and exhaustion. Maria would drift off for a few minutes, then wake up disoriented and confused. Sometimes she forgot where she was. Sometimes she thought she heard helicopters, but when she listened carefully, there was only silence. The insurgents returned to their checkpoint across the street, but Maria was too weak to be afraid anymore. She lay against the wall, sipping water when she could, and trying to keep breathing. Her medical bag was still with her, and she looked at it occasionally, wondering if there was anything inside that could help, but she was too weak to open it. As the sun began to set on her 3rd day in the shop, Maria heard a sound that made her heart race. It was distant at first, barely audible over the ringing in her ears, but gradually it got louder and more distinct. Helicopters. American helicopters. Maria tried to sit up straighter, straining to hear better. Yes, definitely helicopters, and they were getting closer. She could hear the insurgents across the street shouting to each other, their voices urgent and worried. The sound of gunfire erupted again. But this time it was different. This time there were answering shots from automatic weapons that Maria recognized as American. The firefight was intense, but brief. Within minutes, the insurgent voices were gone, replaced by English-speaking voices using military radio procedures. Maria tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. She tried to move toward the front of the shop, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. All she could do was lie there and hope that someone would search the building. The voices were getting closer. Maria could hear boots on concrete, the sound of doors being kicked open, American soldiers clearing buildings one by one. They were being thorough, professional, systematic. Clear! She heard someone shout from the building next door. Moving to the next structure, came another voice. Maria gathered what little strength she had left and managed to knock over a can of food near her position. It made a small, metallic sound as it rolled across the floor. Not much, but maybe enough. She heard the footsteps stop outside her shop. Did you hear that? Yeah, something in there. Maria tried to call out again. This time she managed to make a sound, though it was barely audible. There. Did you hear that? Sounds like someone's in there. The front door of the shop burst open, and bright tactical lights flooded the interior. Maria squinted against the glare, trying to see the figures behind the lights. Holy shit, we got a survivor in here. The lights lowered, and Maria could finally see clearly. 3 soldiers in full combat gear were standing at the entrance to the shop. They weren't regular army like her. Their equipment was different, more advanced. Their movements were precise and professional. Navy SEALs. American soldier, Maria managed to whisper. Staff Sergeant Santos, Army medic. The lead SEAL was already moving toward her, his weapon lowered but ready. Ma'am, I'm Petty Officer Martinez. We're going to get you out of here. Martinez knelt beside Maria and immediately began assessing her wounds. His hands moved quickly and expertly, checking pulse, breathing, and bleeding. Behind him, the other 2 SEALs were securing the shop and setting up a defensive perimeter. How long have you been here? Martinez asked as he worked. 3 days, Maria whispered. Martinez looked up at his teammates with an expression of disbelief. 3 days? Jesus Christ, ma'am. How many times were you hit? 11 bullets. The SEAL medic stopped what he was doing and stared at her. In his years of combat experience, he had never seen anyone survive 11 gunshot wounds for 3 days without medical attention. It should have been impossible. 11 hits, and you lasted 3 days? He said quietly. Ma'am, you're one tough soldier. Martinez immediately got on his radio. Falcon Base. This is Neptune 6. We have found Staff Sergeant Santos. She's alive but critical. We need immediate medical evacuation. Copy Neptune 6. What's her condition? Multiple gunshot wounds, severe blood loss, possible internal bleeding. She's been here for 3 days. There was a long pause on the radio. Say again. Neptune 6. Did you say 3 days? Confirmed. 3 days. With 11 gunshot wounds. Medical evacuation is inbound. ETA 4 minutes. Martinez turned back to Maria, who was trying to stay conscious despite her exhaustion. 4 minutes, ma'am. Just hang in there for 4 more minutes. But Maria was thinking about Thompson and Johnson, her teammates who had been trapped in the overturned Humvee. My team, she whispered. Are they okay? Martinez exchanged glances with his teammates. Ma'am, we found your vehicle. Your teammates didn't make it. I'm sorry. Maria closed her eyes and felt tears running down her cheeks. She had survived 3 days of hell. But Thompson and Johnson hadn't made it through the first hour. The guilt hit her harder than any of the bullets had. You did everything you could, Martinez said quietly. From what we can see, you held off the insurgents long enough to give them a fighting chance. You're a hero, ma'am. The sound of helicopter rotors was getting louder. Through the shop window, Maria could see the dust cloud being kicked up by the landing aircraft. Her rescue was finally here. As the SEAL team prepared to carry her to the helicopter, Maria thought about the past 3 days. The pain, the fear, the desperate struggle to stay alive. She thought about Thompson and Johnson. About her family back home. About all the soldiers who weren't lucky enough to survive their wounds. She had made it through the longest 3 days of her life. Against all odds, despite 11 bullet wounds, despite being trapped in enemy territory without help, she had survived. But as the SEALs lifted her onto a stretcher and carried her toward the waiting helicopter, Maria knew that the hardest part was just beginning. She would have to live with the memory of those 3 days for the rest of her life, and she would have to find a way to honor the sacrifice of her fallen teammates. The helicopter lifted off from the dusty street in Fallujah, carrying Maria toward safety and medical treatment. Below them, the abandoned shop where she had fought for her life grew smaller and smaller, until it was just another building in a war-torn city. But Maria would never forget those 3 days, and neither would the Navy SEALs who had found her still breathing when everyone else thought she was dead. The helicopter ride to the field hospital was a blur of medical activity and controlled chaos. Maria drifted in and out of consciousness as the flight medics worked frantically to stabilize her condition. IVs were started, oxygen was administered, and pressure bandages were applied to wounds that had reopened during the move from the shop. Petty Officer Martinez stayed with Maria during the flight, holding pressure on her worst wounds and talking to her constantly to keep her awake. He had seen many wounded soldiers during his career, but he had never encountered anyone who had survived what Maria had been through. "Talk to me about home," Martinez said as the helicopter raced toward the base. "Tell me about your family." Maria's voice was weak, but she managed to respond. "My mom makes the best tamales in Phoenix. She's going to cry when she finds out about this. She's going to cry because she's proud of you," Martinez replied. "Wait until she hears what you did." The helicopter touched down at the field hospital with a jarring impact that sent fresh waves of pain through Maria's battered body. Within seconds, a team of doctors and nurses was surrounding the aircraft, transferring her to a gurney and rushing her toward the trauma bay. Dr. Sarah Williams, the trauma surgeon on duty, took one look at Maria's wounds and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. 11 gunshot wounds, 3 days without medical attention, severe blood loss, and possible internal organ damage. By all medical logic, Maria should have died hours ago. "Get her to OR 2 immediately, doctor," Williams ordered as they wheeled Maria through the hospital corridors. "I need blood in the OR now, at least 6 units. And call the orthopedic surgeon. Some of these bone injuries are going to need immediate attention." Maria was barely conscious as they prepared her for surgery, but she managed to grab Dr. Williams's arm as they were about to put her under anesthesia. "My teammates," she whispered, "Thompson and Johnson. Are they really gone?" "Doctor." Williams looked into Maria's eyes and saw the pain there that had nothing to do with bullet wounds. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "But right now, we need to focus on keeping you alive. Your teammates would want that." The surgery lasted 14 hours. Dr. Williams and her team worked methodically through each wound, repairing damaged organs, removing bullet fragments, and reconstructing shattered bones. The bullet that had hit Maria's chest had missed her heart by less than 2 inches. The one in her stomach had somehow avoided hitting any major organs. The bullets in her limbs had caused significant damage, but nothing that couldn't be repaired. When Maria finally woke up 2 days later, she was in the intensive care unit with more tubes and wires attached to her body than she could count. Her first sensation was pain. But it was different now. Clean, medical pain instead of the raw agony of bullet wounds. Her second sensation was surprise. She was alive. A nurse noticed that Maria was awake and immediately called for Dr. Williams. When the surgeon arrived, she was smiling despite her obvious exhaustion. "Welcome back, Staff Sergeant," Dr. Williams said. "You gave us quite a scare there." Maria tried to speak but found that her throat was too dry. The nurse gave her ice chips, and after a few minutes, she was able to talk. "How bad?" Maria asked. "Bad enough that you shouldn't be alive, doctor," Williams replied honestly. "You lost about 40% of your blood volume. You had bullets in your chest, stomach, back, both arms, and both legs. You were in surgery for 14 hours. But I'm going to make it." "You're going to make it. Full recovery will take time, probably 6 months to a year. But you're going to make it." Over the next week, as Maria's condition stabilized, the story of her survival began to spread throughout the military community in Iraq. News traveled fast in combat zones, and soon everyone knew about the Army medic who had taken 11 bullets and survived 3 days alone in enemy territory. Petty Officer Martinez visited Maria several times during her recovery. He brought her updates on the investigation into what had gone wrong with her convoy and how the rescue operation had finally located her. "Your relief force got ambushed about 2 miles from your position," Martinez explained during one visit. "They were pinned down for 6 hours and couldn't move. By the time they broke free, it was dark and too dangerous to search for survivors." "So they assumed we were all dead?" Maria asked. "Pretty much. After 36 hours with no radio contact, the official assumption was that there were no survivors. We were tasked with body recovery, not rescue." "What changed?" Martinez smiled. "Your radio call on the 3rd day. It was weak, and broken up, but someone heard it. Command decided to send us in to check, just in case. Nobody expected to find anyone alive. The SEALs had discovered Maria's location by following the trail of blood and evidence from the ambush site to the shop where she had taken refuge. They found the positions where she had made her stand, the empty shell casings from her rifle, and the blood trails that showed how she had dragged herself to safety. The amount of blood at the ambush site should have killed you before you reached the shop, Martinez told her. The fact that you not only made it there but held that position for 3 days, I've never seen anything like it. As Maria's physical condition improved, she began to deal with the emotional trauma of her experience. The guilt over her teammates' deaths was overwhelming. She replayed the ambush over and over in her mind, wondering if she could have done something different. Something that might have saved Thompson and Johnson. The base chaplain, Father Murphy, spent many hours with Maria during her recovery. He had counseled hundreds of wounded soldiers. But Maria's situation was unique. Survivor's guilt is normal, Father Murphy told her. But you need to understand that you made the only choice possible in that situation. You couldn't carry Thompson and fight at the same time. If you had stayed with the vehicle, all 3 of you would have died. But maybe I could have done something, Maria insisted. Maybe I could have found a way to get them out, Staff Sergeant. You held off an unknown number of insurgents for almost an hour while seriously wounded. You gave your teammates every chance possible. Their deaths are not your fault. 3 weeks after the surgery, Maria received an unexpected visitor. General Patricia Hayes, the commanding officer for medical operations in Iraq, came to see her personally. Staff Sergeant Santos, General Hayes said as she entered Maria's hospital room. I wanted to meet the soldier everyone's talking about. Maria tried to sit up straighter in her bed, but General Hayes waved her back down. At ease, soldier. I'm not here for military protocol. General Hayes sat down beside Maria's bed and spoke quietly. I've been in the Army for 25 years, and I've seen a lot of brave soldiers. But what you did in Fallujah goes beyond bravery. You showed a level of determination and will to survive that's almost superhuman. I was just doing my job, ma'am. Your job was to provide medical support to your unit. Your job was not to single-handedly hold off an insurgent attack while bleeding from 11 gunshot wounds. That was something else entirely. General Hayes opened a folder she had brought with her. The Army is recommending you for the Silver Star for gallantry in action. Your actions saved valuable intelligence about insurgent operations in that area, and your survival provided crucial information about enemy tactics. Maria was quiet for a long moment. What about Thompson and Johnson? Are they getting recognition too? Purple Hearts. Posthumously. Their families will be notified of their sacrifice. After General Hayes left, Maria stared at the ceiling and thought about awards and recognition. She appreciated the honor. But no medal could bring back her fallen teammates or take away the memory of those 3 days in the shop. Physical therapy began 4 weeks after the surgery. Maria's right shoulder had been rebuilt with metal plates. Her left wrist was held together with pins, and both legs required months of rehabilitation to regain full function. The therapy was painful and frustrating, but Maria approached it with the same determination that had kept her alive in Fallujah. During one particularly difficult therapy session, Maria met another wounded soldier named Captain David Chen, who had lost his left leg to an improvised explosive device. I heard about what happened to you, Chen said as they worked side by side in the rehabilitation center. 11 bullets and 3 days alone. That's incredible. Doesn't feel incredible, Maria replied, as she struggled to lift her right arm above her shoulder. Feels like I failed my team. You didn't fail anyone, Chen said firmly. You survived something that should have killed you. That's not failure. That's a miracle. Over the weeks that followed, Maria began to see her experience differently. She started visiting other wounded soldiers in the hospital, sharing her story and providing encouragement to those who were struggling with their own recovery. She met a young Marine named Private Williams who had been shot in the spine and was told he might never walk again. She spent hours with him, talking about determination and the will to survive. She counseled a female soldier named Specialist Garcia, who was dealing with survivor's guilt after losing 3 members of her squad in a rocket attack. Maria helped her understand that surviving didn't make her responsible for others' deaths. 6 months after the ambush, Maria was finally cleared for limited duty. She couldn't return to combat operations, but she could work in a medical facility. The Army offered her several options, including a position at Walter Reed Medical Center in Washington, D.C., where she could help treat other wounded veterans. Before leaving Iraq, Maria made one final request. She wanted to visit the site where Thompson and Johnson had died, and she wanted to see the shop where she had spent 3 days fighting for her life. Petty Officer Martinez, who had kept in touch with Maria throughout her recovery, arranged for the visit. A small convoy took them to Fallujah, now much safer than it had been 6 months earlier. Standing at the site of the ambush, Maria could see the scorch marks where her Humvee had been hit by the rocket-propelled grenade. She could see the bloodstains on the concrete where she had first been shot. The shop where she had taken refuge was still there, its walls pockmarked with bullet holes. Inside the shop, Maria found the corner where she had spent 3 days bleeding and fighting to stay alive. The rice bags were gone, but she could still see dark stains on the floor where her blood had soaked into the concrete. "This is where we found you," Martinez said quietly. "Right here against this wall." Maria knelt down and placed her hand on the spot where she had nearly died. She thought about Thompson and Johnson, about the 3 days of pain and fear, about the moment when she heard the helicopters approaching. "Thank you," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was thanking. Her teammates, the SEALs who had found her, the doctors who had saved her life, or perhaps just the universe for giving her a second chance. When Maria finally returned to the United States, she was met at the airport by her family. Her mother cried when she saw her, just as Maria had predicted. Her father, a Vietnam veteran himself, simply hugged her tight and said, "Welcome home, soldier." At Walter Reed Medical Center, Maria began a new phase of her career, working with wounded veterans who were dealing with their own trauma and recovery. She found that her experience in Fallujah gave her a unique ability to connect with soldiers who felt hopeless or broken. "I know what it's like to think you're not going to make it," she would tell them. "I know what it's like to be alone and scared and in pain, but I also know that you're stronger than you think you are." Maria's story became something of a legend in military circles. The soldier who took 11 bullets and survived 3 days alone became a symbol of determination and resilience. But for Maria herself, the most important part of her story wasn't the survival or the awards or the recognition. The most important part was what came after. The soldiers she helped heal, the families she counseled, the lives she saved, not with a medical bag in combat, but with her words and her presence in a hospital room thousands of miles from Fallujah. Maria Santos had survived 11 bullets and 3 days in hell, not just to live, but to help others find their own way back from the darkness. In the end, that turned out to be her most important mission of all. Years later, when people asked her about those 3 days in Fallujah, Maria would always end her story the same way. "I didn't survive, so I could be a hero. I survived so I could help other heroes find their way home." And in the quiet moments, when she was alone with her thoughts, Maria would remember Thompson and Johnson, and she would promise them again that their sacrifice had not been forgotten. She carried their memory with her every day, not as a burden of guilt, but as a reminder of the price of freedom and the bonds between soldiers that not even death could break. The scars from 11 bullet wounds would always be with her. But so would the knowledge that she had found strength she never knew she possessed, and that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought not with weapons, but with the simple determination to keep breathing for one more day.